I feel, Moore says, that the discussion of this question is frightfully difficult. It's on page 268. What is the question? Well, the question is the one with which we ended the last video. And I'll repeat it. I'll read it again. The two alternatives, namely the alternative that none of us ever knows for certain of the existence of anything external to his own mind. And I think that was the position of Russell in Appearance and Reality. Russell lived a very long time and wrote a lot of things, and you can't say that was his final position, but it certainly seemed to be suggested in Appearance and Reality. That is, none of us ever knows for certain of the existence of anything external to his own mind. And the alternative that all of us, millions of us, constantly do. And the question is, but can we decide between these two alternatives? That's the question that Moore finds frightfully difficult. What remains is 3 or so pretty thick pages of text in which he addresses that question. But the notion that Moore will be able to decide this matter in anything approaching a definitive way is ridiculous, and he knows it, and he's not even trying to do it. But he is trying to do something, and that certainly would be something to support what I think is certainly his own position on the better of those alternatives, and that alternative would be that all of us, millions of us, constantly do, that is, constantly do know for certain of the existence of things external to us. Now, what's his strategy here to at least say something in support of that position, which is a very grand position when you think about it? I mean, and a very large statement. Yes, we do know of the existence of an external world. In that first week, in that first reading, Russell opened up that question. He sought to cast doubts on the obviousness of that thesis, that there is an external world, that we can know it, that we can say things about it that are true. What does Moore have to support his position? Well, his strategy is not so much to argue for that position, but to try to tear apart some arguments against that position. That is, what are... You might say that I think, and Moore never says this, but that there is a common sense position, let's say, that we live in a world, each one of us, the same world. That world consists of things, and that most of those things, their existence does not depend upon us. The world is a world that's external to each of our minds, and that we can know it in some respect, and that we can say true things about it. We might say that's the presumption, so that the burden of proof would be on the skeptic. The burden of proof would be on the person, the philosopher, who claims that is pure dogmatism. So what Moore decides to do here is to look at a typical argument that the skeptic, or person who's sort of trying to undermine our realism that we sort of go about our lives with, one of the arguments, and that is the argument about dreaming. How do you know that what you're experiencing right now is merely a dream, and that all the things that you think are true about your surroundings, right now that I'm sitting down, that I'm wearing glasses, that there's a doorway behind me, that I am in my house in Philadelphia, that I'm wearing clothes, etc., the kind of things that Moore starts with. How do you know that they're not dreams? That you think that they're true, but that ultimately they're not. They're basically delusions that you have. How does Moore attack this position? Well, there's some interesting discussion there in the beginning about things that we dream as opposed to things that are real, and there's some interesting discussion of the fact that, well, you can You can dream that in a dream you can dream that you're standing up, and you can be right. That is, you could actually be standing up while you're dreaming, as while you're asleep. Dreaming that you're standing up, you could actually be standing up, and so your belief that you're standing up would be right. The problem is that it would be kind of accidentally right, that you would be correct, you would have a true belief that you're standing up, but you couldn't be said to know that you're standing up. And this is the real question: can we know things like, and of course know means for more, pretty much know with certainty, can you actually know that you're standing up? There's a lot at stake here for Moore, obviously, in these first assertions that he makes in the beginning of the lecture. Let's direct you to something he says at the bottom of the first column on page 269. He says, I agree, therefore, with that part of this argument which asserts that if I don't know now that I'm not dreaming, it follows that I don't know that I'm standing up, even if I both actually am and think that I am. But this first part of the argument is a consideration which cuts both ways. For if it is true, it follows that it is also true that if I do know that I am standing up, then I do know that I am not dreaming. I can therefore just as well argue, since I do know that I'm standing up, it follows that I do know that I'm not dreaming. As my opponent can argue, since you don't know that you're dreaming, it follows that you don't know that you're not standing up. The one argument is just as good as the other. Unless my opponent can give better reasons for asserting that I don't know that I'm dreaming than I can give for asserting that I do know that I'm standing up. It really puts the burden of proof on, there again, on the skeptic. If I do know that I'm standing up, then I do know that I'm not dreaming. The opponent, the skeptic, says, well, if you don't know that you're not dreaming, then you don't know that you're standing up. But really, what are the reasons given for not knowing that you're not dreaming? And then Moore talks about, again, this is bottom of page 269, the second column, about the evidence of the senses. One of the things he points out is, I think, fairly interesting, and that is that it would be a contradiction to say that, he says that I am dreaming that I'm only dreaming, but I have the evidence of my senses that I'm standing up. But those things would be contradictory. That is, if you have the evidence of your senses that you're standing up or sitting down or sitting in your house, but you're only dreaming that you're standing up or sitting down, that wouldn't make any sense. That is, if you have the evidence of your senses that this or that is true, then you couldn't be dreaming, because the whole idea of dreaming that you're sitting down rather than really sitting down is that when you're dreaming of sitting down, you don't have the evidence of your senses that you're sitting down. It's merely a delusion, it's a hallucination. Speaking of his opponents, again, the skeptic, he says on top of page 270, if therefore they are right, it follows that it is not certain even that I have the evidence of my senses that I am. It follows that it is not certain that I have the evidence of my senses for anything at all. That is, if it is ever the case that I have the evidence of my senses that I'm doing this or that, standing up, sitting down, walking, being in a particular room, then it's not true that I'm always dreaming, because if I have the evidence of my senses for anything, then it couldn't be true that I'm dreaming, because the whole notion of dreaming is that you don't have the evidence of your senses. So then the question becomes this, and he introduces this expression, sensory experience. We could say that right now, as I'm awake and looking about this room, I have certain sensory experiences. I see colors and shapes and what I take to be objects and figures. When I'm dreaming, I also have something like sensory experience, not evidence of my senses in the former sense, but sensory experience. And really the question is there a distinction between the two types of sensory experience? It says, again on page 270, if we use the expression sensory experience in this way, we can say, I think, that if it is not certain that I am not dreaming right now, then it is not certain that all the sensory experiences I am now having are not mere dream images. And then he asks this question, what then are the premises and the reasonings which would lead so many philosophers to think that all the sensory experiences I am having now may be mere dream images, that I do not know for certain that they are not? So the question of whether we can know that there's an external world kind of gets narrowed down here to the question of whether I can say that any of my sensory experiences are sensory experiences of an external world and not mere dream sensory experiences. And that's the final question that Moore is dealing with, and perhaps, and I apologize for this, just one more talk to see what his answer is.